Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to the final author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Maybe you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is a guest I have been dying to have on the show for a very long time. Now, my guest today developed a love for storytelling from a young age. She especially loves to tell stories that feature her Greek heritage and Orthodox Christian background. She is currently living in the DC area and plans to write more adventure stories in the future. And you can follow this incredible person on their social media for updates, which I'll provide the link down below. And in today's episode, viewers and listeners, we'll be talking about her debut book, Countess and the Corsair, which I am so excited to talk about in great detail. It is historical fiction, which I absolutely love. And this time period where this book takes place, I am so excited to dive into it. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest, author Sophia Sempeles. Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, Sophia. You're welcome. Now, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. But before we begin today, I'd like to ask you a little fun, little icebreaker question. Is there anything about your personality that not a lot of people know about?
That's a great icebreaker question. And I gotta think about it. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I guess that I can be pretty introverted, but I can also be really silly, and I think that takes people off guard because they think of me as reserved, which I can, but I can also be funny too, and I think that surprises people when they learn that.
Nice, Sophia. And as mentioned in the introduction, we are going to be talking about the Countess and the Corsair. Now,
Yes.
without giving too much away to keep the mystery, what can you tell us as a brief overview of your book?
Yes, so The Countess and the Corsair is a historical fiction novel. It takes place in the late Byzantine Empire. And without giving anything away, it's about a countess. She's sort of living in exile in Catalonia with her grandfather. And her home is ransacked by pirates, and one of her family heirlooms is stolen. And so she and her friends have to set off on an adventure to retrieve that. And, they have a lot of adventures and romance and things along the way. So
Nice, very nice. So, for you, Sophia, as mentioned in your bio, you have had a knack for storytelling very early on. You love stories. What would you consider your definitive aha moment that really pushed you to write this story?
So this story, I was actually in Barcelona. I was on a trip in 2023. I was in Barcelona, and I was visiting a fortress in Costa Brava, which is near the shoreline. And it's the real fortress that I talk about in the book. And it's the tour guide told us that the fortress gets ransacked used to get ransacked by pirates. So nobody wanted to live there. And that the pirates used to go from Catalonia all the way to Constantinople. And I was like, oh, that would be such a great book. That would be amazing. Like, that would be such a fun book. So that's where like the seed was planted. And when I got back home, I just started outlining and drafting what that might look like. And yeah.
Nice, very nice. Now, would you say that historical fiction is like your preferred genre to write in? Do you also love history as like a research base, or are there other genres that you would consider writing in down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I do love history, but I'm not like shoehorned into this specific genre. I'm also a big fan of fantasy, things like that, romance, and different. Like I'm not like one specific genre I have to have, but I do love history. I majored in literature and history when I was in college. So that is definitely part of my background, but yeah.
Nice, very nice. Now, before we get into the backgrounds, the behind the scenes of this story, there are a few fan questions that I'll be asking you throughout the interview. And this fan question, which I'm very excited to ask you because I don't think I've gotten it for a lot of people, especially historians, is this. My viewer asks, why did you decide to focus on the Byzantine era of your book? And when I read that, that was a very interesting question because you don't really see a lot of historical fiction books set during the Byzantine era. So what really drew you to using that as the background for this book?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Most of the time when people write about pirates, it's the Caribbean, or Africa, the coast of Africa. So it is an unusual setting for the genre. But I guess I'm of Greek descent. I'm American, but my ancestors came over from Greece, so I have an emotional tie to that time period for sure. The glory of Constantinople, if you will. And I just think it's a great time period. It's underutilized. Usually when you think about Greece, you think about, excuse me, you think about ancient Greece, you think about like Sophocles, and then you just jump ahead in time and all of a sudden we're in Athens in like 2000, right? There's a lot of like history in between there. So yeah, I just like the time period. It's a great time. I hope more people write books about it. I think that would be great.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. As a classical historian that's been taught about Roman history and Greek history, you're absolutely right. I mean, we always see those specific eras being used as backgrounds and backdrops for numerous historical fiction stories of the past. Very rarely do we even get a mention of the Byzantines because they existed for a long, long time, from the late antiquities era all the way up to the early modern gunpowder era, which is absolutely fascinating. And there are so many stories to talk about or using them as a backdrop. So let's dive into that, Sophia. So what was sort of the inspiration behind the Countess and the Corsair? Was that the initial idea, or was it a series of ideas, and this was the one that made the most sense to you?
Well, because I was telling you about that fortress when I was in Catalonia, which is in Spain, which is not part of the Byzantine Empire. It's actually the western part of the empire. But when I was there, that fortress was built in like 1200. So I knew that it had to be late. If I was going to do Byzantine Empire, it had to be like late Byzantine Empire because that's sort of towards the tail end of it. But that fortress needed to exist, and I wanted the story to start at that fortress, even though it's not even in the empire. But eventually, the characters get into the empire, and so that's how I picked. Like I picked the year is like 1315 is the year that I have it set in.
Ooh, okay.
So, yeah, so I knew that the fortress existed and the empire still existed. They hadn't been taken over by the Ottomans yet. So that was sort of the idea. I could have, if the fortress had been built before 1200, I might have set it earlier in the empire. Like maybe around the time of Constantine in like 330, 337 or whatever, because that's also a very fun time period. And but that's sort of how that came to be.
Nice. Now, as regards to the skeleton of the book, the outline, did you have a very specific rigid outline that you followed, or would you consider yourself a more spontaneous writer? Like you knew the beginning, you knew the end, but the middle, we'll see where it goes. We'll see where the characters take us.
Yeah, so I always outline. I'm a big believer in the outline, but I don't like to be too rigid in my outlines because I find that that's like less fun. There's not as much discovery as you're writing if you're too rigid. So I knew what I wanted to happen in the beginning. I had some things in the middle that I knew needed to happen. And then I had a really clear idea of my ending, which is important. I think it's really hard to write if you don't know where you're going or you don't know how it ends. So I had that. And so I basically followed that outline. And then I was just, as I was writing, I was adding things wherever I needed it. My first draft was 82K and I realized stuff was missing. I needed more scenes and stuff. And so by the end, it ended up being like 91K words. So I figured it out. I got there eventually, but I am a believer in outlining. So
Awesome, awesome. Now, did you have a strict ritual or routine that you followed to keep you disciplined and getting your book ready for launch?
yeah, so I actually did NaNoWriMo, which doesn't exist anymore, but you can still do it in November. The organization doesn't exist, but that's National Novel Writing Month, which is in November. And I did that in 2023. I just sat every day. I sat down, I wrote, I tried to write at least 1,000 or so words every day. And I got a good chunk of it done in November. And then subsequently, a few months later, I finished the first draft.
Awesome, awesome. Now, going back to the cover of your book, as you mentioned earlier, off camera, that book cover was created by your friend. Now, how did you guys decide that that was the cover for this book? And again, did it go through any iteration? Did you want to have like a different mosaic? Did you want to do like a more trade market style book cover that you see, or did you want to have its own voice?
Yeah, so my friend Brianna Camp, she's an artist. She helped me. She painted the cover. She came up with several designs, and I knew that I wanted it to be sort of Byzantine art inspired. So that was sort of what I told her. I was like, I don't know what I want, but I know it needs to be Byzantine art, basically. And so she gave me a couple of different versions. The early versions kind of looked a little too similar to iconography, like church iconography. And I didn't want to be like blasphemy, you know. I didn't want to make people think I had like an icon on my book. I didn't know how like church would feel about that. So I was like, okay, it needs to be more secular, so we're not offending anyone, but I still want to be true to the art style. And then we were talking about like pirates and pirate ships and things like that. And I was like, oh, can you put the Hagia Sophia in the background? Because that's sort of a staple of Constantinople, now Istanbul, but at the time it was Constantinople. And that building still exists. It's not a church anymore, but that's in the background of it right here. So that's how we decided on that. So she did a great job. She's so talented, my friend. So
Awesome. Well, that's great. That is amazing, Sophia. Now, when you began writing this book, another fan question, what really surprised you about the writing aspect of this story, of this historical fiction novel?
So you said what surprised me?
Yes. What surprised you? Was it like, the research? Was it the type of characters? Was it the certain story you want to follow? What really stood out to you as you were writing this book?
Well, from a research perspective, I had to keep looking up to making sure like when things were invented or when certain phrases would have been said. Like at first, a lot of my characters said the word okay because that's how I speak normally. And I was like, well, I want this to be a little bit historically accurate, like obviously I'm not writing it in Greek, right? So I'm writing it in English and it's modern English, but I wanted it to seem kind of historically accurate. So I had to go back through the manuscript and take out words like okay or sure or like things that are like slangy, things like that. And then just like making sure when things were invented or what things were called. At one point there was a chandelier in a scene and chandeliers weren't a thing yet. At least not how we see them today. And then also they hadn't invented sofas yet. So I had to come up with like a settee thing. At one point, someone was sitting at a settee because they didn't have a couch. I was like, oh, I have to take this out. So that kind of surprised me. You don't really think about that before you start to write. So
I know the feeling. I know that the hassle of writing historical fiction and trying to be as accurate as possible and not trying to use a lot of more modern vernacular in storytelling. It is a pain. It is very, very strenuous, but it is worth it in the end to try to bring a story to life that not only entertains and engages people, but immerses them in a past long forgotten. So now let's talk about the characters of the story, the Corsair and the Countess. And again, without giving too much away, how did you write them to be complex, compelling, but most of all, authentic to the story?
Sure. So I always like to make sure that, every character has a character arc, even the minor characters. It's obviously not a major part of the plot, but even minor characters have a story arc. Um, the character can't be complex if they don't have a story arc. So they start in one place and then they go on this journey, and by the end they've learned a lesson, or they've made a decision that is different than what they would have made at the beginning of the book. So for the Countess, without giving anything away, she's dealing with a lot of shame. She's dealing with a public scandal. And she's been living her life in a way where, she doesn't want any more scandal. She doesn't want people talking badly about her. She's worried about bringing like shame to her family. And, she doesn't want to get disinherited, and she's worried about that. And then by the end, she decides, again, without giving too much away, that there are more important things, right? So that's sort of like the journey that she's on. And then for the Corsair, which Corsair, for those of you that don't know, is a pirate. That's another word for pirate. He is on a journey all about like revenge versus forgiveness, and he has to decide, also what really matters to him. And he starts the book from a very vengeful place where he's very focused on that, and then he has to figure out, what's really important to him. So.
All right. Now, also a fan question. Who is your favorite character to really explore in this book? And follow up to that, who is the most challenging character to write?
That's a good question. I think that the male lead, the pirate captain, Theodosius, he's probably my favorite, just because he's a lot of fun. And most of the adventure stuff happens with him. So he's probably my favorite. The most difficult was probably the villain, because you never want your villains to be like too evil or like too mustache twirling. But at the same time, you don't want to make them too sympathetic, because then people might be rooting for them instead of the hero. So there's that balancing act that you have to do, where you want them to feel real, but you don't want people to feel bad for the villain, I guess. So, yeah.
Right. That makes sense. And that's something that I talked with another guest on the show, that you want a very good villain, because a hero is the hero, but everyone loves a good villain. But there is that fine line where you want the villain to be engaging for the reader, but sometimes, depending on the story, you don't want the villain to be sympathetic to, as you said, Sophia, where they begin rooting for them instead of the main characters, the heroes of the story. That's, that comes with, fine tuning and understanding our voice as authors. And also, just like in movies where we have very fond moments, fond scenes that everyone talks about, is there a particular scene that you wrote that you absolutely enjoyed writing? And just like the previous question, was there also a scene that you found really challenging to bring to life?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier that I had a very clear image of how I wanted the book to end, which was very helpful when I was outlining. I was like, I know how this book ends. So there's a scene in the climax. I'm not going to give anything away, but basically someone's on trial, and I very clearly had that scene in my head. So that was so fun to write, because I knew exactly what was going to happen, where the characters were, how everyone was feeling. I got to play around with POV a little bit, because most of the book is from the Countess, Alara, her point of view. And at the end, we get another character's point of view. It's all in third person, but we get to see sort of what they're seeing. And so that was so fun. That was probably my favorite scene to write. And as far as least favorite, there's always like moments where you need to connect two scenes. Like there's like something needs to happen in between before you can get from A to B. Something needs to happen, right? And so that's always hard. I struggle with that a little bit, especially if it's not on my outline. I'm like, oh, I got to think of something. But I thought of something. Everything's connected now, but that's probably the hardest to write.
Absolutely. Very, very true. Now, take a little detour from these set of questions. There is another set of questions I do want to ask, and that's, of course, for you as the author, and I've talked about this a lot with other people again, that there is that hesitancy to announce to everybody that, we are authors. We are storytellers. There is that reluctancy to announce that, especially with friends and family. So for you, Sophia, when did you tell friends and family that you were embarking on this new venture of yours, and what was their reaction like?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive family and very supportive friends, and even my coworkers at work that when I told them about it, they were very supportive as well. But I started my Bookstagram around the same time that I was finishing up my first draft. And so I was pushing it to my family, people who know me. I was like, yeah, I have a Bookstagram. I was like, follow me so that I can get more traction and be my own marketing department. And that's kind of how I told them. And then they sort of found out about the book through my Bookstagram. So yeah.
Sweet, sweet. Now, I don't know if you did beta readers or ARC readers for your book, but if you did, what was their reaction like? And did that give you a clear picture of the story that you wanted to tell and share with people when it was published?
Yeah, so I did both. I had beta readers and ARC readers. And that's, invaluable. I recommend that to everyone should have beta readers for sure. And yeah, they give good feedback. I got a lot of feedback about like if something didn't make sense, like I mean with the beta readers, if like something didn't make sense or if they felt a certain character said something that was too harsh. I got some feedback. It's not in the book anymore. I've cut it. There's a line where one of the characters, Selena, she says something and it was like too harsh. And a lot of the beta readers were like, she shouldn't say this. It's too much. And so I ended up cutting it for that reason. So that was so helpful. You sometimes you don't know until somebody else has their eyes on it. So that's really helpful. And then, by the time it gets to ARC readers, the book's done. You can't change it at that point. But I had 3 ARC readers and they all gave me very positive reviews. So I'm happy with that.
That's awesome. That's really awesome, Sophia. And of course, I will be remiss if I didn't ask this question, which is, of course, dealing with the dreaded imposter syndrome, because we all go through that as authors. I don't care what people say, we always go through that. So for you, Sophia, how did you overcome imposter syndrome?
Well, a little bit every day. I guess for me, it was tough because I'm an indie author, so I'm self-published. And so there were moments where I was like, I don't have the validity of a publishing company, right? Like I don't have an agent being like, this is good. So you sort of have to, you have to just keep going, keep your head up. And, I look at reviews from other people. I'm like, well, these people liked it, so I must be doing something right. So,
Very true. Very, very true. And kind of the same thing in mind. Another thing which also strikes authors is the dreaded writer's block, because there are going to be days where we don't want to write or we cannot write because we don't have a very good idea or any idea at all. So for you, Sophia, how did you?
I think you froze. Oh, can you see me?
Yeah, there was a little issue there. No worries, I'll be able to remove that in post. But as I was saying before that, how do you deal and how did you overcome essentially the dreaded writer's block?
Yeah, so outlining helps. That's why I think outlining is definitely a must. Because without that outline, an outline, is like, it's like a roadmap. So you know where you're going, and that helps a lot. And doing like thought dumps, brainstorming before you start. If I think of something, I'm like, oh, this would be really good, like later in the book. I try to write in order. This is just easier for me. So if I think of something, I'm like, that scene that I need to write later, I write it down. So then when later comes and I'm writing it and I'm stuck, I can look at my notes and be like, oh yeah, I have this note from earlier when I didn't have writer's block. And that helps a lot too.
Awesome. Awesome. So now let's go into what I like to call reflective questions. And the first one is, it's a very loaded one, and that is, what does it mean to be an author in the digital age? Because the industry has changed a lot within the last 20 years. You have AI, which is now taking a bigger threshold in the publishing industry. The market is saturated. Some have argued oversaturated with more and more books. Some books that are written with the purpose of expanding the literate word, while other books were just written just to exist in the void. And for authors in general, regardless if you're traditional, indie, or hybrid, it's a very different world, and showcasing our individuality is more so more difficult than it ever was before. As one of my guests said, it's never been more difficult, it's never been more easier to get a book published, but it's never been more difficult to market one's book. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on this, Sophia. For you, when you launched your book, what did it really mean to you being an author in the digital age?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Where it's both easier and harder at the same time. I think, before the digital age, you couldn't really be self-published. That wasn't really a thing, I think, before the digital age. So on one hand, it sort of gives you a new avenue to publish. But on the other hand, you're right, there's a lot of oversaturation. There's a lot of, there's just like a lot of books out there. A lot of people are writing books, which is great, right? It's great that there's a lot of books, but it's a struggle sometimes to make yourself stand out. And it can also be hard if you're like trying to compare your book to other things, because you're like, oh, my book is just like this, but at the same time,
Mhm.
it's special, it's different. So, how do you balance like being special and different and also being marketable and being similar enough to other things that people like? So,
Yes. And on that topic, again, of, an oversaturation in the market, a lot of the authors that I have interviewed in my 6, 7 years of doing the show, which is absolutely insane, a lot of the authors that I have interviewed thus far all began their career roughly within the last 5 years during the lockdown years, during the quarantine years. And again, this has sparked this debate of, what is to be an author in the digital age, but
mhm.
more so because of these new voices, if we're in a golden age or an iron age. Some people argue that we are in a golden age because of these voices. Others say that we're more so towards an iron age because we've been able to whittle away those that were not as passionate as writing stories, as opposed to those that are very, very, what's the word, persistent in
Mm.
building upon a career in the publishing industry. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Sophia, as well, if we are still in a golden age or transitioning into an iron age.
Yeah, I think I would say the Iron Age thing probably. I think the Golden Age is when Harry Potter was coming out.
Mm.
So I was obviously too young to be an author at that time. But I think when Harry Potter came out and Percy Jackson, and they were making a lot more like movie book adaptations, they still do that a little bit, but it not like it was in like the early 2000s, late 90s. They started to have that boom of adaptations. I think that was sort of a golden age, and I do think we're more in an iron age now. But I'm hopeful about the future. People love to read, so I think that that'll never go away.
Absolutely. Now, another big thing which is important to talk about, which is AI in the publishing industry. I talked with a lot of authors about this, a lot of artists, a lot of editors and historians, and they all agree generative AI does not have a place in the creative sphere. AI as a tool, that's always going to be ingrained with everything we do. We cannot get rid of it. But generative AI, we do have a say in it because we can put a stop to it. And I talked to a lot of people about this, and they all agree that generative AI creates a false sense of creativity because it mass produces it. And again, Sophia, I would love to hear your thoughts on generative AI and how it is, in essence, harmful to not only the publishing industry, but the written word made by human voices.
Yeah, it's definitely very harmful because it's essentially theft. Because AI is a robot; they can't come up with their own original ideas. They have to get it from somewhere. So they're really just regurgitating stuff that humans have written. So there's that theft element to it. And then it's also like really lazy. So that's why I'm not scared of AI, because I think other than the theft thing, it's just really lazy. I can't even see myself really enjoying a book that's so lazily put together. Um, because when you're writing, it's not just about putting words on the page. I mean, that is an important part of writing, but it's also about, what's the themes? What are the messages? What are the life lessons? Why does this matter? And a robot can't really do that, I don't think so.
No, that is absolutely true. Absolutely very true. So now let's dive into the next set of questions, which is, of course, the business side of being an author. And that's a little icebreaker question, Sophia. When your book was published, what really surprised you about that stage of being an author? And looking on your journey thus far, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of launching your book?
Yeah. So when I sort of announced when my book was coming out at the beginning of the year. So my book came out in June, and I announced that it was coming out officially in January of
Mm,
this year. So that only gave me like a 6-month window, and it was a 6-month window of my own creation. And I thought, oh, that's plenty of time. Like, it'll be ready. I'm not going to be stressed. And keep in mind, like, I mean, the book was edited, so the book was done, but I had not yet asked my friend for the cover, so I hadn't done that. And I'd never published on Amazon before, so I didn't really know what I was doing.
hmm
I had to learn all of that from scratch. Some people helped me, but I was learning everything brand new, and it all worked out. It all worked out. I'm happy with the results, but I wish that I'd given myself more time, for sure.
Yes.
If I do this again, or when I do it again, I would give myself more time.
That is very true. That is very, very true, Sophia. And another thing about the marketing aspect is, of course, knowing our audience and knowing who we're writing for. And that is a very tricky thing because as authors, we want to showcase our individuality, but we also realize if we're writing in a specific genre, there is an expectation that we have to follow. So for you, Sophia, since this book is of the historical fiction variety, how did you not only showcase your individuality as an author to show people this is how you approach storytelling, but also writing a story in a way that is familiar to those of the historical fiction variety and that it makes sense, that it doesn't feel out of place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess for me, again, I think I mentioned earlier, I was like paying attention to the lingo because I didn't want them to use modern slang,
Mm,
or use technology that had not yet been invented. Um, at one point, one of the characters, they like high fived, but the first high five wasn't until 1977. Fun fact, or like 78 or something. So I was like, okay, they can't high five. That's not a thing.
mm.
So there's all of that stuff you need to keep in mind with historical fiction. At times I do call it loose historical fiction because I think, given its adventurous and happy ending of it, I do think that it's a little bit like a loose historical fiction in that regard. But that's what I kept in mind for that. And then I do think that I do have my own style of writing. Of course, we all have our own style, and hopefully people, you just kind of have to hope that the audience likes that. I don't know if everyone who loves historical fiction is going to love my style, and people who love my style might not necessarily gravitate towards historical fiction. So you just sometimes you just have to hope that people like it. I don't know.
Absolutely very true. And that's okay as authors. We know the audience that we write for, and there are going to be those that aren't going to be pleased or invest in our books. And that just comes with trial and error. What I will say is that I do plan on getting myself a copy of the Countess and the Corsair because I am always looking for historical fiction. I've been reading a lot of fantasy, but I would kill for some good historical fiction. So I cannot wait to read your book and add it to my list. And another important question, or rather fan question, that I want to ask you at this point, Sophia, is of course themes. Now, themes are important, but as we've seen recently in the modern uh, publishing industry, tropes seem to dominate the advertising aspect, as opposed to what are the themes that people can draw from. Now, for you, Sophia, what are the central themes of your book?
Yeah. So, well, first, thank you for getting a copy. I appreciate that. I did want to say also, I think it's TikTok's fault that everyone talks about tropes, because it's very easy in a TikTok video or a reel to be like, oh, this book has forbidden love, or this book has enemies to lovers, or whatever. Like, that's very easy in a TikTok
Mm.
video. So I blame book talk. I think that's their fault. But yeah, but as far as themes go, there's the forgiveness theme, the theme of found family, family's not always blood related, things like that. And then the themes of corruption, like how sometimes powerful people can become very corrupt, and
Yes.
and not judging people based on where they come from or their situation in life. Things like that are all big themes in the book.
Very true. Very, very true. And another important thing about the marketing side, or rather the business side of being an author, is not only just researching material for the content of the book, but also getting an idea of the types of books that exist in said genre. Sometimes I've talked with authors on the show, and they explain that a big thing when it comes to researching stories, if let's say you're writing in a fantasy genre, is to read fantasy books to get an idea of, how the author writes, how do they introduce the magic system, how do they set the world building. So for you, Sophia, what are some of the books you've read by other authors that really gave you a sense of how to write historical fiction in your way?
Yeah. So what I ended up doing is I read like a lot of pirate books, and then I read books about the Byzantine Empire. There wasn't a lot of overlap. I guess my book's kind of special like that because it takes place in the Byzantine Empire and there's pirates. So there was one book that I absolutely loved. It's called To Catch a Pirate. It takes place in the Caribbean, so it's a little bit different, but that book's great. It was very it was the historical side of it, but it was fun and adventurous. And I was like, this is exactly the vibe that I'm going for. So a very different book, not the same plot or anything, but it had a very fun vibe while maintaining that historical feel. And then also there's another book called Nefertiti, which is Egyptian historical fiction about the Egyptian queen Nefertiti by Michelle Morin. And there's no pirates in that book, but she also has this way of telling you the story and making it feel very fresh, even though it's historical. And there's a lot of drama and intrigue and mystery. And so these are things that I'm like, oh, okay, this is the kind of vibe that I want. So things like that. And then I was just doing research. There's not a lot of Byzantine Empire. I think we talked about this earlier. There's not a lot of Byzantine Empire books, at least not popular ones. I couldn't find a ton. I mean, you can read a textbook, or a more traditional historical book, not historical fiction. So I had those, and I'd studied in college some of Byzantine history. So yeah, that's what I did.
That is very true. That's very, very true. And I have to agree. I've done research for my own books in that regard of researching, nonfiction books, what do the sources say about, the Byzantines and stuff like that, where it is a background, but I knew just from the story that I want to write, okay, I'm not writing about a specific historical character or one that's based upon it. It's an original character that's set in this, historical fiction world. And ultimately, that goes into another question, which I want to ask you, Sophia, as another fan question. And that is, of course, what books have been your favorite to read that have, in a way, inspired your creative aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I guess growing up, I loved Percy Jackson growing up. I was big on Percy Jackson, with Greek mythology. and stuff. I liked Harry Potter when I was a kid. I'm not super big on Harry Potter anymore, but I was when I was a kid. So I think books like that, and then I don't know. I just anytime a new fantasy, I just love fantasy. I'm definitely the next book I write is going to be fantasy for sure because I've read a lot of fantasy, and so that just sort of captures your imagination, I think. And then other historical fiction books too, same thing. So yeah.
Nice. And actually, this kind of goes to the next question. The fan question is, will you ever consider writing in doing an historical fantasy book or just straight fantasy?
Yeah. So if there's no magic in my book, but if there had been magic, then it would have felt exactly like a historical fantasy. But yeah, those can be fun too. I think there's a lot of inspiration for me from like Pirates of the Caribbean, which is a historical fantasy. So I love that vibe. So maybe someday, yeah, I love that. I'd love to write about like Greek mythology too, and
Ooh,
yeah, fairy tales and stuff. So yeah, yeah.
that's a good one. That is a really good one. I would just say this: if you ever get a chance to read this for like just inspiration or just for fun, Chris Hackett's Invicta: The Fall of Rome, which reimagines the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the dramatic forces, but it has to deal with a lot of mythology, like the Roman gods and goddesses that are in hiding. You have a demigod who's on the run by the Catholic Inquisition. And they do introduce, which I was really happy to see, the Byzantines under Justin the First, and of course, meeting his son Justinian, who becomes Justinian the Great, probably one of the most famous of the Byzantine emperors of the late antiquity, early medieval era. And yeah, it's a really great book, and I highly recommend checking it out for research and also just for fun. And this kind of goes into something that I've been dying to ask you, Sophia, because I've been asking a lot of guests about this question, and it boils down to these three things. As authors, when we write a book that we're very, very passionate about, we also realize that sooner or later it has to come to an end. And that's a tough thing to call, because where do you draw the line in the sand? Yes, the outline will tell you exactly where the story is going to end, but if you're in the headspace, you can keep writing and writing. But ultimately, unless you plan to make this into a series of books, it has to know when to end. And not only that, making sure the ending is satisfying for not just for the author, but for the reader themselves. And ultimately deciding that, yes, this book is finished. So ultimately, Sophia, can you walk us through that moment of your journey when you finished writing the book and knowing full well that the ending that you landed on was the ending that you wanted, and that it is the ending that is going to be satisfying for readers?
Yeah. So for me, once the climax, the main conflict of the book has ended, you just have to sort of decide how you're going to resolve things, right?
Mm.
So for me, I knew how the climax was going to go down. And what I really just wanted at the end is sort of a final shot in the book, if you will. It was a resolution between two characters who don't actually spend that much time together during the book. I'm not going to say who these two characters are, but they're sort of not really a misunderstanding, but one of the main character, I'll say one of them is the main character, Alara, the Countess. She thinks that she's sort of at odds with this person, and the whole book she's sort of carrying that around. And then at the end, she realizes that she's not at odds with them, and there's sort of this reconciliation, which I'm trying to be vague. But I knew that was sort of the final moment, because that was when, not only was the conflict resolved, but her character arc had a nice like little period at the end. It was like done. And I just think it's a great final scene. So
Awesome. And I imagine, uh, do you plan to possibly go back to this book and make it into a series, or is this for right now a standalone?
Well, right now it's a standalone. I don't have any big plans for a series for it right now, but I could wake up tomorrow with an idea for a sequel and then there you go. But right now, it's sort of all resolved. Everything at the end is sort of resolved. So I think of it as a standalone.
Awesome. Awesome. So before we get to the final question, I'm now going to throw at you, Sophia, a series of rapid fire questions that I've been saving for the very end. So here's the first question. Which is more difficult to write, a conflict scene or an emotional scene?
You mean conflict like fighting, like they're in a fight?
Or a physical conflict, or just, conflict between two characters arguing or discussing, anything like that.
Okay. Then I'm gonna say an emotional scene, I think is harder because I think conflict scenes are directly into the plot. And assuming you've outlined, plotting is pretty easy, assuming that you have an outline. And so I think that the emotional stuff can sometimes be harder because you want it to feel real, but you also don't want it to drag. You don't want it to, you don't want the reader to be like, okay, like let's get through this. But then you also don't want it to be too fast because then it might not feel realistic, or it might not feel like, like if a character is grieving, you don't want them to grieve too quickly because that's not realistic. But you don't want them to grieve too much because then people are like let's get back to the sword fights and stuff. So
Nice. Next question. Which is the most difficult sense to showcase in the book?
the most difficult sense, like, oh, you mean like the of the senses?
Of the senses, yes.
Taste, maybe.
Ooh, that's a good one. I can
Yeah.
see it as being the difficult one. I would also definitely possibly either sight, not sight, probably like sound or
Mhm.
smell. I would definitely say either of those two would definitely be, in the top 5, probably most difficult.
Yeah.
Next rapid fire question. Were there any movie inspirations for certain characters?
Yes, I guess with like the male lead, there's a show, I don't know if you've ever seen it, Once Upon a Time. And
Yes.
in that show, there's a character, Killian Jones, or Hook, Captain Hook.
Mhm.
And so it's not a copy, but I would say that the male lead has sort of a Hook vibe. So
Nice, nice. Next rapid fire question, and I'm actually gonna go through some fan questions and use those. Let us see. Ooh, okay. This is a very good one. Were there any Greek words that you thrown into the book that are completely different to the modern Greek language?
oh, probably not. I think all the Greek words I use are modern Greek, I think.
Uh,
Yeah, because how do I explain this? I don't, they wouldn't have been speaking ancient Greek, and
yeah.
they might have been speaking like biblical Greek. But so it's just easier. I used modern. When I used the Greek, it was the modern Greek.
All right, all right. And ooh, okay, I like this one. I like this little last question of the rapid fires. If you had to return to the historical fiction genre after writing in other genres, what is an era or time period that you would like to focus on in another book?
Ooh, I don't know, maybe the French Revolution. That could be kind of fun.
Ooh, that'd be a good one. I could definitely see that. There's a lot of good stories to talk about for that. Nice.
Yeah.
And to cap off this amazing final author interview for the month of October, Sophia, here is the final question. Ultimately, we talked about a lot of great things in this interview, from your passion for storytelling, the amount of heart you put into it, the reactions you've given, and everything like that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what do you want people to take away from your book and your future books down the road in other genres? And what is the piece of advice you would like to instill in the next generation of authors?
Wow, that is a big question. Well, I mean, every author's dream is that readers will be inspired, or that they'll learn something from what you've put out there, learn something about humanity. I don't know. Or that a future writer might pick it up and be inspired. That's always the dream. I would love that if someone was like, oh yeah, your book inspired me to write or to read or to do whatever. I think that's great. And if they learned something about the Byzantine Empire that they didn't know before, that's also great. So yeah.
Absolutely. Very true. Very, very true. And also, I would like to add to that as another piece of my own advice, viewers and listeners, is when it also comes to another thing, which is reviews, like getting feedback from our readers, take them with a grain of salt in a sense that not every book that we write as authors is going to hit our target audience. It's going to be a 50-50 chance, and we have to accept that. There are going to be people who are going to love our books, and there are those that aren't going to love our books. It is not a reflection of our character as an author. And for those that are watching this who are aspiring writers, it is not a reflection of your own as well. So I would just like to say that as an official cap off for the month of October here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Want to give a huge thank you to Sophia for coming on the show, making her official debut on the Wandering Scribe podcast. Now, Sophia, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out, as well as buy a copy of your book?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at sophia.writing.books. And I'm also on TikTok at Sophia_writing_books. And you can find my books on Amazon.
Nice. I will link all that down below in the description of this video, viewers and listeners. And as I'll probably be making up most of these later in the weeks, but I have a special announcement to make. Now, if you've seen my previous author interview, I mentioned that I was going to be making my first ever appearance at a book festival later in November. Well, I am here to officially announce that I will be tabling with Mystery Inc., that's INK, bookstores at the Orange County Book Festival on November 15th from 2 to 3 before I go on my very first fantasy author panel at 4 o'clock. So if you are in the Orange County area during that time on that day, please come on over. I'll be selling copies of Michael, Son of Persia, and The Gathering. I'll be linking all of that down below in the description of this video, as well as subsequent videos as we get closer to the day. Again, thank you so much, everybody, for your love and support, for joining us for the final author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I do have a few special episodes for the month of October, some Halloween-themed episodes, which will be coming out later in the next few days. So be on the lookout for those. But until next time, a huge thank you to Sophia for coming on the show. We wish her the very best on her author journey from one to another. I cannot wait to read The Countess and the Corsair. And I'll be posting my official review on my website, thewanderingscribe.com, as well as linking where you can buy it yourself. Until next time, this has been The Wandering Scribe and The Wandering Quill, signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Happy Halloween, and we'll see you in the last few episodes of October. Bye.